Hello and welcome to the Booker Prize podcast with me, James Walton.
Me, Jo Hamia.
And this week is the second part of our review of this year's Booker Prize shortlist. Last week we tackled If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffrey, This Other Eden by Paul Harding, and Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein. So if you want to know what we made of those, make sure you give it a listen. Jo, we gave a bit of a kicking to This Other Eden. You loved Study for Obedience, and we both quite liked If I Survive You. Any second thoughts on any of them?
Gosh. No, I think on reflection, I do stand by everything we said.
Fair enough. Well, let's move on to the remaining three then. So what books are we left with, Jo?
Okay, so this week we are going to be tackling the remaining 2023 Booker Prize shortlist: Western Lane by Chetna Maroo, Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, and The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. We're going to be starting with Western Lane.
Tell me about Western Lane then, Jo.
With pleasure. It's one of many family sagas on the shortlist, and it's narrated by Gopi, who, along with her older sisters Mona and Kush, has recently lost her mother. Western Lane is actually the name of a sports community centre the sisters visit often in the novel. All three of the girls have been playing squash since early childhood, but after the loss of their mother, the sport takes on a new resonance for Gopi and her father, who trains her. And as she begins to show a particular aptitude for it, preparations for a tournament in Durham become a channel for the family's grief. The prose is really sparse, but it's littered with jewels which take the form of really gorgeous details, sometimes drawn from the sisters' Gujarat heritage and sometimes from descriptions of squash matches being played out, in particular via recordings of real-life Pakistani player Jahangir Khan, who Gopi watches on a loop to strengthen her own game. And it's Maroo's debut novel, so there's a certain etiquette in discussing those. But James, I believe you actually genuinely did quite like this one.
I know, I really like this one. Mm-hmm. As you say, there is a lot of squash in it, but it's not just squash. On the opening page, she's playing squash, as she will do, and she hears the noise from the court next door, which she describes as a steady, melancholy rhythm of someone she can't see. And that sort of seems to me to be, her mother's absence being present, which it is throughout the book. Also on the opening page, she talks about the echo, which is the ball striking the wall of the court, is louder than the shot itself, which in a way is how the novel itself works, I think, which the prose is very quiet, very gentle, very understated, and yet there's a deep pain beneath it, and it has a strong resonance, and the deep pain that the prose both reveals and tries so hard to conceal, and I think that is really brilliantly done. So here's just a fairly typical bit. There's she's at home, and it says, air had been trapped inside our radiators for more than a month, which meant the big sections were cold and the house never got properly warm. My sisters and I dressed in long sleeves and hooded tops and said nothing to Pa. In the past, Pa would have fixed the problem right away, but now he ignored it. Mona came and stood next to me. It wasn't just the warmth we were seeking. We wanted to feel the knocking as we stood against the radiator. We understood the knocking was only the air trapped inside. We wanted to feel it. Again, there's just an enormous amount of pain somehow behind that. And I think I would suggest in a psychologically realistic way, this isn't a book where, they're going to say, Dad's going to say, so I love you, Gopi, and she's going to say, I love you, Dad. But there'll be just little scenes like this. There's one bit where she, about the only time, really breaks down and sobs for her mother, and then she develops a fever shortly after that, and she's in bed. And we have this. And I think this means, Dad, I love you, Gopi, I love you, but this is all we get. Pa never came into our bedroom, but he did then. Maybe it was only once. It was just me and him. He sat on a child's stool in front of the dressing table for a while, not saying anything. But as he was leaving, he came by my bed and rested his hand lightly on my chest, and then tucked my blanket in such a way that for the whole night I didn't dare move in case I undid what he had done. My lamp glowed orange, and I could hear my own heart beating softly. Again and again, there's just that. We get glimpses of how badly the father's suffering there, I think, even, just in the way he tucks in, rather clumsily, the blanket. And this makes it all the more shocking and powerful when things do burst out. There's one bit where they're at a fun fair where Mona rather likes this boy who starts sort of flirting with someone else, some skateboard wielding hussy. And then
I think we call her a manic pixie dream girl.
Okay. Manic pixie dream girl. And Mona sort of says, look, you realise none of this would be happening if Ma was still alive, and Kush just absolutely goes for her.
Yeah.
Then get up and sort of carry on. But just those little moments. There's one bit, most dramatically of all, really, one bit where Gopi overhears her dad talking to a woman who works at the centre.
Yes.
There's also the mother of a boy that Gopi quite fancies called Jed. And Jed's mum and Gopi's father are often going out to have cigarettes together. She overhears her dad saying to Jed's mum, the girls, sometimes I look at them and I think they will eat me. And she reflects that this is probably the saddest thing he said out loud in his whole life. And that out loud's quite good. So she knows again how much he's hurting. But actually, she then goes onto the court with her dad and absolutely wallops the ball into his jaw.
Yeah.
It seems deliberately, but again, that's left. So she's angry with him. She's sorry for him. And all of these feelings are unexpressed. And I think a book that can do the unsaid so brilliantly, it's quite an achievement, given that by definition you can't say it.
Mm.
So I think it's extremely good.
I agree. I think I would add to that. Possibly, I read this in a very personal way, but it's also a book that's extremely adept at tracking the evolution of girlhood to womanhood. And the sisters in this novel are kind of forced to mature a lot faster than they otherwise would have had their mother still been alive. And you see that most clearly with Mona, who kind of becomes the matriarch of the family, gets a job at a hair salon sweeping cuttings. And
yeah, she's the oldest one, and she starts cooking, doing all the cooking and so on.
Yeah.
And also starts sort of slightly throwing her weight around as well.
Yes. You can't help but feel for these girls and what the absence of their mother has done to them. It's not only transformed them, but the way that they're perceived by their father. So one of the predicaments Gopi has is that she actually resembles her mother quite closely. It makes her relationship with her father that much more slightly painful. There's this bit that really got to me that reads, when finally I came in, Pa would look up from his papers and he would just stare as if he was startled. It's Ma, Kush would tell me later. You look like Ma. If we arrived at home to find that Mona hadn't cooked, Pa would wait for me to come in and he'd send me and Kush to the VG store. We'd come home with tins of baked beans and mini frozen pizzas, which would make Mona angry with the three of us. What visitors we had were very interested in what we ate every day, and this too made Mona angry. Her moods did not seem to trouble Pa. He didn't seem to notice. And so much underlying grief bound up.
Yeah, that's right. Well, they're all sort of grieving separately, aren't they, really? And it isn't going to be a family of group hugs or anything. So Mona does it by sort of tackling their domestic duties. Kush more withdraws into herself more. Gopi takes up squash, moderately obsessively. And again, it never quite comes together in, as I say, what seems to me an authentic way.
Do you think?
Yeah, I do. I do think the idea that they don't all sit around and say, how are you feeling? How are you feeling? Let's all discuss more. And yet they all know it. And we know it too. Any reservations about this at all, really?
I think the only other thing that gave me slight pause, but I did sort of towards the end, once the tournament is over, found myself going, I wonder why squash, like of all things, as a narrative device in this book.
Do this too much squash?
Maybe not too much squash, but I just sort of felt I understand the whole significance of a Pakistani squash player and representation, and maybe that's why. But still, I just kind of found myself thinking, a novel about grief and sisterhood and maturation and squash.
The squash does kind of work for those metaphorical reasons that I mentioned right at the beginning, almost.
I suppose. I mean, I guess it works in terms of the kind of discipline that this novel is very engaged in as a practice for the sisters, and also the prose.
And also there's a thing in ghosting apparently in squash, which is you basically do everything except the ball's not there.
Oh yes, that's so
and
true.
That's I think.
All right.
Again, without
You've
strutting,
convinced me.
Okay, is the absent mother that they're doing everything except what really matters is not there.
Yeah, that's a really good theory. Love that. That's probably actually just a very valid reading of the book that I missed.
Okay, so let's move on to our next book, which is Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. This is the 5th novel by the Irish writer Paul Lynch, whose previous 4 have been somewhere between well-received and prize-winning, all of them, I think. Of those, 3 were historical novels of various kinds, but Prophet Song, by contrast, is set in a near-future version of Ireland, where a totalitarian government has come to power, and the novel begins with something that's never a good sign in such circumstances, a knock on the door late one night by the secret police. And from there, the book is seen almost completely through the eyes of Eilish Stack, a suburban microbiologist, wife and mother, whose husband Larry is taken away by those same secret police. And from then on, tries heroically, really, to keep her family together and to take care of her senile father too, as the political situation in Ireland gets worse and worse and more oppressive. Jo, what did you make of this one?
Yeah, it was the most surprising one on this list for me. I'd expected to feel ambivalent about it, and in fact I was really deeply affected by it. I think to be completely honest, I'm not very au fait with my Irish political history, and so had only really a glancing understanding of the political background or how accurate Prophet Song may be as a dystopia. But in a way, I kind of didn't care because it's so firmly rooted through Eilish's perspective as a mother trying to keep her family together. And I think the core question of this book really is, why do you stay?
Yes, that's right. He says one of the sort of recurring things in because she's got this sister in Canada who says, just for God's sake, get out and come to join us.
Yes.
She says, well, what about Dad, who's the senile guy? What if he falls and has a, has a fall, as all people do? Or, what about the children? I'm hoping to, I've got plans for them. And there's this idea that an important factor in history is people who leave it too late to leave.
Yeah. I think near the end there is this. It's sort of like civil freedom and unfreedom, and how excruciatingly slowly you lose your basic human rights, and you only realise when it's too late. So there is this bit that Eilish is speaking, and she says, "I suppose other people seem to know, but I never understood how they were so certain. What I mean is, you could have never imagined it, not in a million years, all that was to happen. And I could never understand those that left, how they could just leave like that, leave everything behind, all that life, all that living. It was absolutely impossible for us to do so at the time. And the more I look at it, the more it seems there was nothing we could do anyhow. What I mean is, there was never any real room for action. That time with the visas, how we were supposed to go when we had so many commitments, so many responsibilities, and when things got worse, there was just no room for maneuver. I think what I'm trying to say is that I used to believe in free will. If you had asked me before all this, I would have told you I was free as a bird. But now I'm not so sure. Now I don't see how free will is possible when you are caught up within such a monstrosity. One thing leads to another thing until the damn thing has its own momentum, and there is nothing you can do. I can see now that what I thought of as freedom was really just struggle, and that there was no freedom all along."
And I think it's brilliant on why people find it hard to leave places where you think, for God's sake, just get out, because it's not that easy, for sure.
It is, and I think something that Lynch does in a really affecting way that feels personal to each of these characters, rather than as something that's just simply told to you or given an exposition, is why you may feel it really, really important to stay. So, for example, Eilish's father has dementia, and at a certain point, her sister is trying to convince Eilish that he should be smuggled out to Canada. And Eilish says, "What my father needs is to remain at home, to be surrounded by his memories, to have the past within reach. In time, there will be nothing left to him but shadows, a strange dream of the world. To send him into exile now would be to condemn him to a kind of non-existence." And she's talking about her father, but in a way she's also talking about herself, because quite recently her oldest son, Mark, has been sent for conscription. And she's been thinking he could return at any moment. He'll slide open the patio door and slouch into the kitchen as though he had never gone. He'll go to the fridge and give out that there is no ham and pull a chair, asking if there's any news of his dad, Larry Stack, who has also disappeared. I suppose it's this idea of what is there to make of us if we don't have our home, our memories, our material possessions. I think there's one, actually I found quite affecting passage where Eilish is looking at her mother's wedding ring, an engagement ring, and she thinks, well, I used to treasure these, but now they're just objects that I could sell for the cash that I need to buy basic necessities like food, batteries, water. And that's another kind of stripping away of her humanity as a result of war. I think as well, one of the really compelling things about this book to me is how clear-eyed Lynch is on portrayals of war. There's a point at which media is being essentially just censored by the GNSB. No one's...
They're the secret police, aren't they? Yeah.
Yes, and no one's completely totally sure of what's happening outside their own houses. They have to rely on international news. And so one of Eilish's children, Bailey, takes a drink of milk and asks if the country is now at war. And Eilish studies the milk moustache and the question in his eyes. They are calling it an insurgency on the international news, Molly says. Molly is Eilish's daughter. But if you want to give war its proper name, call it entertainment. We are now TV for the rest of the world. I think Lynch is really attuned to the fact that a lot of the cruelty of war is that if you don't have proximity to the pain that it inflicts, you just don't care. And I think one of the things about Eilish is that she's only able to delude herself up to the point that her house is literally bombed, and then she is firmly in proximity to pain.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I really like the fact, well, there's a great phrase in this, happiness hides in the humdrum. So there's one bit before it all falls to bits where they're just all watching telly together, and that's all you want, really.
Yeah.
And it's also quite exciting when they, it becomes quite a thriller as they try to escape. But I do have one problem with this book, and it is quite a big one, I'm afraid, which is that I just don't believe the premise of a totalitarian island, especially as Paul Lynch doesn't really explain anything about how it came to be. All we get is one secret policeman saying on page 10, Mr. Stack, you will be aware, no doubt, of the Emergency Powers Act that came into effect this September in response to the ongoing crisis facing the state. That's it. Now, in an interview on the Booker Prize website, Paul Lynch is asked, why is Ireland done so well in this year's Booker Prize as usual? And he says, because the government's so nice to writers, really. We don't pay any income tax. We get plenty of grants and so on. So
they don't pay any income tax?
No. Artists in Ireland don't pay any income tax.
Do you have to be born in Ireland for that to work?
No, I think people have moved there for that reason.
I'm moving to Ireland.
But just before you do, Jane, let's hold those thoughts because we're going to take a short break now, after which we'll be back with part 2.
Welcome back to part 2 of this episode of the Booker Prize podcast. So, James, you were saying...
So the question is, how did Ireland get from that place to this place here? And he just doesn't imagine that enough for me at all. There's an interesting puff from Colin McCann, who's an Irish writer, and he says about this book, about totalitarianism, if it can happen in the most impossible place, it can happen everywhere, is what's great about this book. But there's a clue in the word impossible. It can't happen in the most impossible place. It couldn't happen in Ireland, I don't think. Or at least, if an author's going to base an entire novel on the fact that it has happened in Ireland, he needs to imagine everything more thoroughly. I don't think you can just buy this. So there's the BBC still going, the Irish Times is still going, presumably the EU, social media. Northern Ireland is still British. The Catholic Church is still a thing. Yet none, what they're up to doesn't just go unexplained, it doesn't get mentioned. So I would suggest it's not so much a liberal dystopia, it's almost a liberal fantasy, really. The idea that, we're all us nice people are beleaguered on every side by the right. It actually says in Beasting by Paul Murray, fantasies of disaster can actually be an attempt to find relief. I think there's signs in the book also that Lynch kind of knows the problem. There are people. So when the national service is introduced to fill the repressive army, one lawyer says, "Can you imagine that in this country?" No, you can't. Also seems that when the government's about to win an election, so people are actually voting for it, somebody else says this is unthinkable for a country like ours, which it is. There's then a ban on reading foreign news with news channels blocked, a total internet blackout. And Bailey, this kid, says, that's ridiculous. How can they just turn it off like that? Because I think I've got a theory of what's going on here, which is the giveaway is when Eilish looks at a Dublin street and says she's watching the street as though it belongs to some other city. And I reckon in the end it kind of does, because we know from interviews that this book was inspired by Syria. So Paul Lynch has said, he looked at Syria and he saw the implosion of an entire nation, the scale of its refugee crisis, and the West's indifference. And he wanted to write about this. And then he goes on to say, I couldn't write directly about Syria, so I brought the problem to Ireland as a simulation. Now, 2 questions there. Why couldn't he write about Syria directly? And secondly, what does he mean by a simulation? Does he mean that what if Ireland was Syria? But it really, really isn't. And it can't suddenly just be without everything about Ireland, its history, its geography, its people, its political system being completely different. And they're not completely different in Prophet Song. So I don't think you end the book thinking this must be what it's like in Syria, but just this is unbelievable in Ireland. And I think there's almost signs here and there, little fossils of the fact that it was once a book about Syria. So Mark watches ISIS beheadings on video too, which inspires him to join the rebels. But that seems to belong to a Syrian novel. And I think even that bit you read, we are now TV for the rest of the world, I think is what Syria had become or has become. But I can't imagine that happening in Ireland. It would be all right if it was put just as a sort of mythical thing, but it's not. It's put as something that could happen in Ireland. Now, if it did happen in Ireland, everything else in the book is fantastic. And all that stuff you talk about is fantastic. The family stuff is great. But I don't. Do you think I'm being too literal-minded? I just cannot get over the fact that it wouldn't happen, couldn't happen. It's just. And it's not imagined thoroughly enough.
In a way, I think Lynch does sort of address the points you're making head on, quite close to the end of the novel. And he writes, the prophet sings not of the end of the world, but of what has been done and what will be done and what is being done to some but not others, that the world is always ending over and over again in one place but not another, and that the end of the world is always a local event. It comes to your country and visits your town and knocks on the door of your house and becomes to others but some distant warning, a brief report on the news, an echo of events that has passed into folklore. And I think the point of the book perhaps is to turn an improbability into a reality, and that's why it really does spend all of its time focusing on Eilish and focusing on family matters and expounding on the horrors of war through the loss of patriarchs and children and meat in a shop and the availability of batteries, the price of paracetamol being, tripled, quadrupled. But to be really honest with you, James, and this might sound a bit inane, I just really didn't care whether it was possible for it to happen in Ireland or not.
I mean, no, fair enough. That's got to be the only way of enjoying this book. It's not to mind, and I just did.
It works for me emotionally, and because I think actually it's all the better that it is a bit fuzzy on the kind of logistics of Irish politics, because you can transpose it more easily onto, sounds corny, but your soul. You can feel for these characters a bit more.
As I say, I think it's more a liberal fantasy than a liberal dystopia. I think we love the idea.
I think it's an effective one, at the very least.
But I think it's a weirdly thrilling idea that, this could happen to us. The Far Right could easily take over Ireland. No, they couldn't.
I hope you're right.
I'll put some money on it. as I say, lots of good things about it. Also, I'm not dead keen on the fact that every section is a single paragraph. We talked at the beginning of the first episode of this two-parter about the weird fashion now for extremely long paragraphs.
Oh, I think we should actually talk about this. You might be unconvinced, but to me, this was actually one of the most compelling things about this book, because it tripped me up a lot for the first 50 pages. And then I realized that we were about to read a war novel, and war is chaotic and messy, and it's incoherent, and you miss things and they fly past you before you can make sense of them. And so does this prose. And I think actually it's another book that bears rereading. As we said last episode of Sarah Bernstein's Study for Obedience, I think if you were able to cogently pick everything up from every sentence in this book, it would not be as effective. You're sort of reading it in this really emotional blur. And that works for me. The prose really sustains the atmosphere of chaos and tragedy.
No, I mean, clearly that's a matter of taste. You know, that question, what about the children? Well, mine is, what about the readers? Why not just give us a little paragraph break? And also endlessly long sentences, which are only endlessly long sentences because the book commas instead of full stops. I mean, obviously this again is taste. For some, that'll be mesmeric. For me, it became a bit of a tick.
No, I mean, I don't think it was necessarily mesmeric. I just think it, there are like bits of language that I found particularly ingenious. Like I think a couple of times Eilish sleeves a coat on, which is very poetic, and I actually quite enjoyed it.
She coins a trolley supermarket from the trolley. There's quite a lot of where she likes to turns verbs in.
And that I kind of can understand an impatience towards that. But as far as those sentences that kind of gallop ahead in present tense, it's not necessarily mesmeric. It's just sort of like you're being drowned in all of this detail, and I think it's fitting given the context. I think it's fitting that you're overwhelmed by a war novel.
No, fair enough. Well, in fact, that's interesting because I think this might be the book we most disagree on then, probably. Paul Lynch's Prophet Song. And that just leaves us with which book, Jo?
It leaves us with The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. It's by far the longest novel on this shortlist. Most of these come up to more or less 300 pages. And The Bee Sting clocks in at 642, the first edition hardcover. And again, another family saga. It's narrated by various members of the Barnes family, which include patriarch Dickie, who is running his father's Volkswagen dealership into the ground, his beautiful and unmoored wife Imelda, whose backstory is fairly traumatic and involves Dickie's brother Frank, their teenage children Cass and PJ, who are variously affected by their once affluent family's bankruptcy. Cass turns from star student to party girl just in time for her final exams at school, while PJ is blackmailed and physically threatened by a local boy who's convinced that Dickie has wronged his mother. And through these four narratives, each of which has quite a distinct style, we come to understand the significance of several underlying characters and events, such as the presence of a Polish mechanic named Richard, who kind of inveigles his way into the Barnes' lives, a piece of family lore about Imelda being stung by a bee on her wedding day, the dynamic between the Barneses and a rich cattle farmer named Big Mike and his Brazilian housekeeper. But ultimately, the novel rests principally on the secrets each character feels they cannot divulge and the actions their shame drives them towards. And I think just funny and tragic, and to me at least, possibly the easiest novel on this shortlist to like. How do you feel about it, James?
I absolutely love this. I mean, a spoiler alert, it is my favourite by some distance. I read it last, and I must say it was great to just have, shapely sentences. Proper paragraphs that last as long as a paragraph should be and remind you of what a lovely thing a paragraph can be if it ends at just the right time. Also, even some jokes, even jokes in slightly bad taste. I mean, hurrah! So it starts with Cass, who's the teenage daughter, and her friend Elaine, and they're looking at Miss Universe Island pictures, and it says they all had some adversity they had overcome. One had been a refugee from a war in Africa. Another had needed surgery when she was a small girl. a very thin contestant had once been very fat. The adversity had to be something bad, like a learning disability, but not something really bad, like being chained up in a basement for 10 years by a paedophile. Now, see, at last, some inappropriate laughter that we wanted. And in fact, a bit later, they go to see the family photos. Elaine wants to see, this is Cassie's sort of glamorous friend, Elaine, who she rather looks up to. And they're in the good room where, strictly speaking, they shouldn't have been. But Elaine wanted to look at Uncle Frank, who she thought was hot, even though he was dead. Now,
there's something quite tragic in that, though.
No, exactly. Now, this is how the book works. So that just seems a funny line there. But as the book goes on, and this is how the book works all the way through, the fact that Uncle Frank was hot and is dead is crucial to the lives of everyone involved. And that happens all the time. Things that seemed like jokes or passing stories or little references turn up to be setting up the plot, or really the series of plots. And what a series of plots we got. I mean, you did an astonishing job of summarising it there. But all of that's just for starters, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it just does not stop. So seen through all the eyes of all four family members in turn, quite long sections to start with. And they complicate everything. Remember when we interviewed George Saunders a couple of weeks ago, and his idea of how fiction should work is it constantly makes us rethink what we thought.
Yeah.
And this does that all. It suggests that he would love this book. And at the start of these two episodes, I made my lament for lost unruliness and how many of these books are a little too polite. And this one just really isn't. I mean, it's quite over the top, actually, quite lurid.
Yeah.
Almost melodramatic, I think. Unbelievably packed with incident. There's bits of the supernatural. At times it reminded me of Thomas Hardy in the complete relentlessness of the bad luck of all the characters involved, especially in timing. Remember the bit where Tess delivers a letter to Angel Clare, that Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which will solve quite a few of her problems, she thinks, and she sticks it under his door, but actually it goes under the carpet as well, so Angel never sees it.
Never gets it.
Tess was lucky, because there's, in this book, so many times when a character's about to do something that might save the day, and then there's an interruption or a bad luck of some kind. Also reminded me, I don't know if you know John Irving, World According to God, Prayer for Owen Meany and stuff, but he again is quite melodramatic plots, quite a lot of them fueled by lust, but also great writing. I mean, I think, for sentence after sentence, paragraph after paragraph, page after page, for 640 pages, as you say, Paul Murray just keeps the great sentences coming. I mean, you could argue almost that he overdoes the great similes, but there's millions of those. It's very funny, it's very sad, as you say. And also that sense that the four family members do love each other, but they just can't do it. There's quite a lot of times in the book where people write a text message and then don't send it, or write an email and then don't send it.
Yeah.
But the book is full of unsent messages of a more metaphorical kind all the way through. And that's the beginning of my rave. I could go on for now, but I'll leave it there. Did you was excited by this book as that?
Yeah, I adored it. I think we were talking earlier about the fact that this shortlist, at least measuring good, kind of comes on a scale relative to each novel, but I think The Bee Sting is just objectively, I'm going to use a phrase of yours, ripping good yarn. It's just like one of the things that seems to be a recurring theme on this shortlist, at least to me, is that it's fiction that's close to home for the writers, perhaps with the exception of This Other Eden, but that's actually to a fault. But I digress. To me, it's just so beautiful to have this man in his mid-40s opening this, huge novel within the consciousness of a teenage girl.
And convincingly so from your personal experience.
Completely, I think the only unconvincing thing is the text speak and the shortening of words and misspelling of words. But I'm completely willing to overlook that because it's utterly believable, and it happens again and again and again. You've got this kind of, I think now often compared to Molly Bloom, kind of passages of Imelda, who is vain and sort of a bit too quick-tempered and a bit too romantic, but still believable as a character. The flaws that she has are believable. Her background is just the perfect amount of traumatic, and she's by no means made into an angel. I'm trying so hard not to spoil this.
No, there's so much plot to spoil,
Yeah.
and we'll try and not spoil any of it because it's so great. Imelda's father is a kind of well, interesting character.
Yeah, no,
We can't spoil anything.
Can't. But I just think to have this variety of voices, which are all written with care and with really kind of exquisite attention to detail, is on this shortlist so refreshing, and I adored it.
But it's a book of enormous plenitude and richness and so on. But all the many, many plots and all the revelations and everything actually all build up in the end to a single Friday night where the stories of all four of them separately are reaching their climax. And then when that happens, they intermingle and the thing reaches another climax. I mean, it's shaped. It uses coincidence. It has improbabilities in it. But I think that's just all part of its massive, generous, and again, unruliness. The unruliness that I've missed in quite a lot of these other books.
I feel like, in a way, we've been less tidy or thorough with our assessment of this book because it's just straightforwardly brilliant. So that's The Bee Sting by Paul Murray, and I think we both adore it.
Yeah, we do. And it's great to end on a high, actually.
Yeah, really finally.
No, a book I fell on hungrily, actually, in this context.
So there we go. That's our shortlist in total. And just to recap, in the first episode, we covered If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery, This Other Eden by Paul Harding, and Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein. And today we've spoken about Western Lane by Chetna Maroo, Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, and The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. So I guess all that remains really is to pick and choose our favourites, speculate on what will happen on the night of the ceremony.
Yeah, well, should we do a top three in reverse order? So what's third for you, Joe? I'm gonna go for Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein as my third.
Okay, I think my third place goes to Western Lane by Chetna Maroo.
And you did say you quite like a tie. If it had been a tie, what would the other one have been?
It would have been Prophet Song. But I think ultimately I'm going for Western Lane in third place because I think that Chetna Maroo is in greater command of her prose. Which is not to say that Paul Lynch isn't, but I think it's a more finely crafted novel.
Okay. My second is Chetna Maroo's Western Lane. Mm-hmm. Your second is?
My second is The Bee Sting by Paul Murray.
Joe. Why is that your favourite? You said it was the most entertaining. It's quite interesting that. So your most entertaining, the one you, let's face it, enjoyed the most, isn't your winner.
There are different forms of enjoyment.
Sure.
So I think one form of enjoyment is entertainment, and the other form of enjoyment for me. Do I reveal my first now?
Yeah, I suppose you better have it.
Well, it's Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein. And that presents a completely different form of... This is purely personal taste. I'm very aware that I might sound a bit pretentious, but I take very great pleasure in being manipulated by prose in ways that I don't quite realise, and picking at it to find out what exactly has been done to my brain. And although the Murray is the most entertaining, ultimately that's just not the most important thing that fiction can do for me. I think I can just as easily be entertained by my friends down the pub.
Well, you won't be shocked to hear that my favourite by, as I say, some distance is Paul Murray's The Bee Sting. I just think it's all the basic stuff that novels can do. It kind of restored it. Plot, you got your great characters, you got your, as sentence by sentence writing is fantastic. I mean, it's to me, it's pretty much a dream.
So now an interesting question. We have our personal favourites. Yours is The Bee Sting, mine is Study for Obedience. But what do you think will actually win?
It's interesting we've got the same top three, just in a slightly different order.
Oh, we do actually?
Yeah, we do, yeah. So we should mention that the three that didn't make our nod, you gave an honourable mention to Prophet Song by Paul Lynch, and then the other two were If I Survive You and This Other Eden by Paul Harding.
Yes.
I mean, I must say, I think it's very difficult. I mean, I'm never any good at predicting what's going to win. Because it is so personal taste, and not only is it personal taste, it's personal taste to five very different people. Mm. But I would be somewhere on the gutted side if The Bee Sting didn't win. Study for Obedience, all the things you say are true, but...
Oh, no, I don't think it's going to win at all, unfortunately.
I imagine booksellers are all the way with Paul Murray, aren't they? That's the one that's going to fly off the shelves if it wins more than the others, I think. Although but Paul Lynch could do that too. Maybe this other Eden could as well, on the grounds that it's so exactly what everybody seems to want to hear at the moment.
Yes, I think the three that seem most likely to win to me are The Bee Sting, because it is just a crowd pleaser in every sense. And as you say, this other Eden, I think, whilst perhaps it wasn't for us, to me is also a potential winner, because it does seem to speak to that instinct readers have at the moment to want to be good and to want to be virtuous. And most people seem to think that the novel achieves that ambition quite well, despite our reservations.
Our serious reservations, yes. If you want to hear those, you can listen to last week's podcast.
I would love Study for Obedience to win. I think the only precedent that a book like this would win is something like The Milkman by Anna Burns, which was a huge surprise winner in 2018.
Yeah.
Yes. But I just somehow don't see that happening this year. So I think I have to agree with you. I think The Bee Sting is just, you can so clearly see it as the winner.
I agree with that completely. It kind of restores your faith in what a pretty much traditional novel of social realism can do, which is, break your heart, make you laugh, relish every sentence. I think it is in the shuggy vein.
And that concludes part 2 of our overview of this year's Booker Prize shortlist. Remember, if you haven't heard what we thought of If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery, This Other Eden by Paul Harding, and Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein, do listen to part 1.
And you can find out more about all of this year's shortlist at thebookerprizes.com, including interviews with all 6 authors, as well as extracts from each book performed by actors including Katrina Balfe, Nina Wadia and Susan Lynch.
And if you've been inspired to read any of the shortlist, which, let's face it, you will have been, because James and I are brilliant, why not share your thoughts at the Booker Prize Book Club? Head to facebook.com/thebookerprizes to do that.
And remember to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok and Substack at the Booker Prizes.
Join us next week for a special episode in which James interviews all 6 shortlisted authors.
Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The Booker Prize podcast is hosted by Joe Hamya and me, James Walton. It's produced and edited by Kevin Miolo. And the executive producer is John Davenport. It's a Daddy Super Yacht production for the Booker Prizes.